Guys, Hades 2 Patch 3 was big. Loads of boons were completely removed and replaced with new ones, the Path of Stars feels like it got a fundamental rework, Possessed Array got a nerf that it probably really needed, and we just got buff after buff after buff for the God's Blessings, which is always exciting. Some of the most interesting changes in the patch to me were the overhauls of a number of the Olympians' Magic Restoration boons, which is what I want to talk about today. The devs really shifted away from the common mechanism with which these types of boons worked, which has changed how many of them interact with the general gameplay and mechanics, which I'm a big fan of in this case. Before patch 3, the majority of the boons that provided magic did so with magic restoration over time effects. 5 out of the 8 gods with magic support blessings had ones like these, giving the player a certain amount of magic per second, usually with some kind of activation condition like standing still, being inside of your cast, or taking a statistical trade-off. In patch 3, all of these boons were altered, and only one of them retained its original method of restoring magic. Let's start with the first one that I found in a run, which was when I had the idea to make this video, because I knew it was going to be impactful. Zeus had his magic boon reworked. Ionic Gain now causes this ball lightning thing called an Aether Font to spawn somewhere in the general area every so often. The frequency determined by boon rarity and level. When the Aether Font is interacted with, it restores all magic, the entire bar. I think this is an amazing rework, because let me tell you, I hated Zeus's old magic boon. I literally never found a use for it. 70% total magic reduction was just too much of a downside for me. And on top of that, magic restoration over time already has an annoying mechanic that you have to play around, being that it doesn't actually work when magic is being used. You can see that in this basic example. The depleted magic is being restored, and then when an Omega attack is primed, it stops, with a short delay after use before magic starts regenerating again. This means that with constant magic use, the bar will be drained, and it forces the player to periodically stop using their more powerful abilities for a while to let it recharge, which might severely lower your damage output and can put Malinois in danger if Omega moves are being heavily utilized for mobility or protection. After the changes, this is much less of a concern with all of the boons I previously mentioned, which I think is awesome. It just makes weaving their effects between barrages of attacks so much smoother, and most of the boons are essentially super buffed, which is just fun, so let's get back into those. I already explained how Zeus's works, no longer providing a steady stream of magic, but instead completely restoring it when using the spawned item. The interval between Aether Font spawns is short enough that there's usually a new one around before magic runs out, which allows for mostly uninterrupted attacks. You just have to make sure to grab one of the balls every once in a while, and you'll have absolutely no magic issues. The only thing is that sometimes the Aether Font will spawn in an awkward location and it gets blocked by enemies, or Chronos spawns a time bubble on it or something, and you can't immediately get to it when you need it. But even if that happens and you run low on magic for a few seconds, you get all of it back when you do get to the orb, and without having to sacrifice 70% of your magic like the old version of the boon. Yeah, I'll take this new one any day of the week. It feels great to use. That's all for Zeus. Next is Apollo. His reworked boon is interesting. Lucid Gain has the same theme as before, giving you magic with the condition that you be standing in your cast. This boon was changed from providing magic over time while standing in your cast to immediately replenishing a large amount if you are standing in it when it ends. And I mean, this is just a straight up better ability. The raw efficiency of the magic restoration is literally better. Casts last about 3 seconds, divide the amount regained for each tier by 3, and you get bigger numbers per second than the original boon. And of course, this effect doesn't care about the whole magic regen pause thing, so it's even better than it looks like on paper. Needing to be standing in your cast the moment it expires might be a little tricky in some situations if there's a ton of enemies around or you're just moving a lot, but that's not really any different than the previous version of the boon, so doesn't really matter. Moving on, Hestia had her magic boon Hearth Gain reworked as well. Previously, it gave a very high magic regeneration rate, but reduced your max HP by 20%. After the patch, it no longer includes the negative effect, and now restores a flat amount of magic each time you deal damage with an attack or special. Note that the effect only triggers once per attack or special, so you can't activate it on multiple enemies, and it only works with normal attacks and specials, not Omega attacks or specials. controls. So it's very basic, easy to understand and make use of, which is good, though I'm not quite sure how it compares to the other reworked boons in this video, since I imagine its effectiveness is closely tied to how fast you can strike enemies, which can differ quite a bit between weapons, so how good it is probably fluctuates a lot. Regardless, it's done a good enough job in the runs I've used it in so far. Pretty solid boon. Now, our last two. I've saved what I think is the most drastic change that one of these boons received for last, but before that, we have Aphrodite. In my opinion, Glamour Gain was terrible. The boon had a rather weak magic restoration buff, and that hasn't changed, though that wasn't the actual problem. The problem with this boon was that to gain the magic restoration effect, you have to be near an enemy inflicted with weak, and the boon itself would inflict the debuff, but only to one enemy at a time and at random. And that's all I should have to say. The boon was just inconsistent, because you had no control over where the effect would be active unless you had another way of inflicting weak. Fortunately, no longer a problem. The boon now inflicts all nearby enemies with the debuff, so as long as Malinois is near something aggressive, she will be gaining magic. Mass inflicting enemies with weak is also just a really good passive effect, especially since weak also got strengthened in patch 3 and now reduces enemy damage by at least 30%. The magic effect may have stayed the same for this boon, but massively increased consistency and an automatic 30% damage nerf to anything that comes into your proximity seems pretty damn good to me. I think this boon probably got the biggest buff out of all of them when compared to how it was before, although the final Olympian who received a magic boon overhaul might have something to say about that. It's Demeter. As I said a minute ago, I think her boon received the most drastic alteration, while honestly still being the most similar to how it was originally. This is because her boon works in the exact same way as before, providing magic regeneration over time while the player is standing still. And yeah, it's still gives a regen over time buff, but it's now percentage based. The normal rarity boon starts with the effect of regenerating 40% of your max magic per second, so assume you'll usually have at least 100 magic, which I think is fair. That means that this boon will give you at least 40 magic per second. If the boon is epic, it starts at 80% magic per second, and one level up on it brings that to 100%, which, yes, means that it restores the entire bar in 1 second, regardless of how big your magic pool is. Having to stand still to activate this effect was always really annoying, but it doesn't really matter that much if you can get all of your magic back in 1 second or less. I mean, pound for pound, on paper, this boon has the highest magic restoration potential by a landslide, and in practice, that really shows. Obviously, this means that it feels way better to use in combat. Honestly, it feels like the quality of life of all of these boons got a massive improvement, along with huge statistical buffs, and that's why I wanted to make this video. I'm a little late to the patch 3 coverage, but I thought that this magic revolution of sorts was still cool enough to talk about. Maybe some of these reworks are a little overpowered, I don't know yet, but changes like these that switch around how the gameplay feels are just really fun to mess around with. Fixed a lot of issues I had with the boons, 100% magic in 1 second. It's awesome, and with that, I'm finished. Tell me what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.